Hello, my name's Heather. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. I mostly make videos about left politics in the UK, and I kind of haven't made one for a while, so apologies if you've been missing them, and if you haven't, then no apologies. But I think I felt a little bit like I don't know what to say about what's going on in the world because of the genocide that's unfolding in Gaza. And so this is a good opportunity to start having those conversations because Talal, who's here, who you may recognise from previous videos we've talked before, has got a chapter in a new book. The book is, I'm going to hold it up, Deluge, and it's about Gaza and Israel, and it really sets what's happening up in context. So it was thrown together very quickly in order to respond to and give background to the current situation. And I think given that it was written, when did you say you wrote the chapters?
It started being written in October and November, and the stats in the book are up to date, if I remember correctly, for December.
Right. December. So actually really quite quickly into the unfolding genocide. I think it holds up really well, because what it tries to do is not to say this is what has happened, but to say here's a way of understanding what is happening. And so it gives context, like the history of the conflict more generally, but specifically the history of Gaza.
Yes, it gives the political background. It gives there's two very important aspects to that history. One is the history of Palestinian attempts to negotiate, which is very often neglected. And another is the history of non-violent protest. And there's a very good chapter on the 2018 Great March of Return. And there are many other chapters which set out the historical context, including on the economic blockade of Gaza. And so this book is really going to be useful for anyone who wants to make the case, and it's an important case that needs to be made, that history did not start on the 7th of October, and that there is a much longer history to pay attention to if we want to understand events.
Yeah, and I think, so I knew a fair bit. I didn't know loads, but I knew a fair bit. But I learned a lot from this book, and I think it's also useful for reference. Like you say, often I think we're told that Palestinians have always rejected peace proposals, and there's a very kind of point-by-point dissection of each of the opportunities where there were negotiations and what was on offer and what wasn't, and that kind of provides a very clear response to anyone who says that. That really it's Israel who has never offered anything that offers a viable peace, that offers that responds to the compromises the Palestinian side have made with any kind of movement towards them. And so I think for that it's good. It's also good for the kind of wider political context for thinking about what Hamas's rationale and motivations might have been for the 7th of October operation, attack, massacre, whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's kind of useful for that. And the section that your chapter is in is on a section on kind of the international response, right?
That's right.
And so there are 3 chapters in that, one on the US, one on the UK, and one on the European Union.
Correct.
So we're going to talk about your chapter on the UK's response, and then we might link it up to those other chapters.
Yeah. So my chapter broadly focuses on 3 elements. That's the government's response to the attack on October 7th and Israel's subsequent military campaign. Then there's a look at the opposition, Labour Party led by Sir Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
And then there's some discussion of solidarity in Britain and how that's unfolded. And I think that the overwhelming message to take away is that our politicians have failed us completely. The ruling class in this country has shown to the world and to the historical record their immense disregard for civilian life, for Palestinian life. And I think that
for representing the people,
and for representing the people democratically.
Yeah.
And I would say that if there's anything politically important to come from this, it's that people start to reevaluate some of the basic premises, whether we are actually living in a democratic society, whether Western foreign policy is a force for good in the world. There are all kinds of myths which are being exploded right now.
Yeah, I think there's a myth that for some of us kind of were exploded before, but I do think that explosion is going wider. I think that and that's something I talked about I had a discussion with Jackie Walker on Redline TV, and we were talking about that, and particularly about the impact on how people understand what's called the rules-based order or international law or human rights. And we can certainly kind of come back to all of that. But yeah, let's start with the government then. Let's start with, like, what the fuck is happening with our government? And I think you're quite good at saying, well, actually, if we take a step back, it's not something which is happening now, it's something which has been going on for a really, really long time. And just maybe we're noticing it more now. So can you kind of give us what led up to this point with in terms of British foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think the pattern to notice is that since roughly the Second World War, Britain has been overwhelmingly a kind of vassal of the United States.
Yeah.
And so British foreign policy has generally very closely followed whatever policy has been made in Washington. And so we see now a repeat of that kind of role, but historically it's been the case a long time. And after the US alliance with Israel sort of became consolidated in the aftermath of the 1967 war, Britain has shown generally a great deal of support for Israel and Israeli policy, even though, of course, these governments continue to pay lip service to a negotiated settlement. They continue to pay lip service to Palestinian rights.
Yeah.
In reality, all of that is belied by their staunch diplomatic and military support for Israel.
Right. And there was something you mentioned that I wasn't aware of, which was a kind of the Israeli and the British governments got together, was it like last year, and said, let's make a roadmap together. And I think it is the case that all this stuff is going on, right? A lot of diplomatic work is going on, and that we don't really notice it because, like, it doesn't make the news because our news is kind of shitty, because it is just diplomacy as usual. But you make the point in that there's nothing about a two-state solution.
Correct. So this conforms to a trend which we've seen particularly since the Trump administration,
right,
which is that even the lip service to Palestinian concerns has started to become abandoned. And so what we have now is Israel reaching agreements with Arab states in the region and reaching those normalization agreements irrespective of any progress on Palestinian rights or a two-state settlement. So that roadmap kind of conforms with the trend that we can now afford to ignore Palestinians. They don't matter.
Yeah.
And we're just going to continue to have this diplomatic and military relationship without worrying about any negative consequences.
Yeah, and that's another point you make, which was that previously there was a kind of counterweight through Britain needing to maintain diplomatic relations also with Arab nations who then were also highlighting the Palestinian cause. And then when they stopped doing that, when they normalised without requiring any movement on that, there was no counterweight, and so Britain's position in a sense got worse.
Yeah, and it may also be the case that with Brexit, the influence of the United States on British foreign policy increased. So not that the EU is some kind of beacon of independent thinking and independent foreign policy, but just that arguably the relationship with the US has become even closer as a result of, again, another counterweight sort of falling out of play.
True. And the other thing you say that's very dominant within that roadmap that we have with Israel now is anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit about that? Because that's obviously a theme which is going to run through.
Yes, so that document includes a formal commitment to fight anti-Semitism, including in what it calls its modern form as delegitimization of Israel. And now I can't recall whether it also includes a mention of the IHRA definition, but it's clear that the government's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, is part of this effort to fight delegitimization of Israel or criticism of Israel, which has been mislabeled anti-Semitism. So the government is following a policy of clamping down on free expression and free thought and free discussion as part of its relationship with the Israeli government.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I think is really disturbing for people, is the way in which clearly Israel is right out there as a rogue state doing horrific crimes against humanity. And yet so much of the structures in our society, the ways our society is working, is being determined by our relationship with that country and with the need to support that to Israel through that. And I think that's a thing which a lot of people are grappling with, because I think obviously our relationship with America is fully determining of that. Mm-hmm. But I think people like to think of the UK as having some kind of independence, autonomy. It feels like we don't have that from the need to support Israel, the need to be on the coattails of the US, and all of that.
Yeah, I think it's completely wrong-headed to believe that the UK makes all these foreign policy decisions of its own accord. The UK actually is under immense international pressure and willingly accepts its subordinate role to the United States. And I think that that's something the solidarity movement also has to grapple with, because the solidarity movement is coming up against huge entrenched power structures. Mm. And it's important to be realistic about the scale of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of us who are part of the Corbyn movement, it's sort of like deja vu, in the sense that the power structures we're coming up against and the mechanisms, although they're being manifested through the British state rather than through the Labour Party, there's a lot of parallels there. Mm-hmm. And again, we weren't maybe, I wasn't so realistic then. I think maybe I'm a bit more realistic now. And obviously once instead of being chucked out of the Labour Party, the sanction is being put in prison, the stakes go way higher, right?
Yes, so one element that I cover in the chapter is about the much increased repression and delegitimization of Palestine demonstrations.
Yeah.
So we have had for months now a media circus which goes on and on about hate marchers, about a mob, about intimidation, about violence, about thugs, and you name it.
Terrorist sympathizers, don't forget. Terrorist sympathizers.
And a lot of it is also connected with Islamophobia. There's a lot of this which alleges hidden Muslim influence. It alleges that Sadiq Khan, as Lee Anderson said, is deliberately assisting his Islamist friends with taking over the capital, that kind of reasoning. Mm. And that's just a pretty obvious manifestation of I shouldn't say obvious manifestation. That's an obvious extension of the government's rhetoric. And so, particularly when Suella Braverman was still Home Secretary, although she's been removed from her post now. But that campaign of and that level of delegitimization is quite unusual.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, including activists, are seeing for the first time just that level of state repression and attack.
It is really surreal, if you've been on demonstrations, to hear the descriptions of them, because they are the nicest, calmest places. People are so well behaved, I think, because we're so aware of the smears that can be made. They are full of children and older people, and families are there together, and everyone's great at making space around people. And it's so weird because there's so few arrests, there's so little trouble, that to regularly get 100,000 plus people together and for there to be so little trouble is the thing which people should be remarking on. It should be an example of how people should behave, and they've become the opposite. It's so weird.
Yes, so if you actually look at police statements and you look at the evidence which has been taken by one of Parliament's select committees,
I
think it's the Home Affairs Committee, they said, in fact, hundreds of thousands of people have participated, and these are overwhelmingly peaceful marches. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Met Police have been perfect, not at all, but they have clearly a more realistic view of the marches than what you see in the mainstream media. Yeah. The Met Police have actually been quite zealous in trying to make arrests because they're under that kind of political pressure. They've talked about facial recognition technology. They've talked about putting up CCTV to monitor protesters. But even they have to admit, when they're giving evidence to a parliamentary committee, that overwhelmingly the protests have been peaceful. So a lot of this...
It is weird when the police are the voice of reason. I kind of find a lot of this is disturbing.
And it's worth saying already under English law that demonstrations face quite a lot of restrictions they have to comply with. And the groups that organize these protests have to put an enormous amount of effort and energy into negotiating routes and days and all of that sort of stuff. And the organizers of the protests have been models of reason and moderation and patience.
Yeah.
And they've dealt with this, I would say, remarkably well.
Yeah.
And so it's really a gross smear of the protests to say that they're violent, intimidatory, thuggish. There's just no evidence to support that.
And like I say, it's the complete opposite. They should be held up as examples of how to be together across all differences, with people who have disabilities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different ages, people from different social class backgrounds, people from different parts of the country, people from different religions, and all together and all getting on and all have a sense of collective, and it's quite remarkable.
I just wanted to add, you didn't mention the Jewish bloc. And the Jewish bloc have been a big presence at most of the marches, and there have been many attendees who've spoken about their experience in the marches, and they don't share the view of the government about the protests, and they've been very clear that they feel completely welcomed and happy to be there. So I think, frankly, this idea that some people are saying, and again with a tinge of kind of fear of Muslims, that London becomes a no-go zone on the weekend, I think is ridiculous.
Yeah, indeed. So we've established a little bit about how the government is acting, how the state is acting. Let's go on to Her Majesty's opposition, the Labour Party, and their position. can you summarise it as it was back in when you wrote this sort of November time?
Yeah, so Labour's position essentially followed the White House, which is they said, we want a humanitarian pause.
Okay.
We don't want a ceasefire. Grown-up politics is a humanitarian pause, and childish radical politics is a ceasefire, even though the demand for a ceasefire was endorsed by the United Nations, even though it was endorsed by every reputable human rights group.
I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it, United Nations? Because in a sense, the bits the United Nations were endorsing it are the bits of the world which have been infantilized by the US and the UK and Europe, right? And have been treated as not able to take responsibility for their own government. So in that sense of we're the grown-ups and you're the children kind of plays out even at that level, I think.
Yes, and it comes through structurally with the use of the veto. The United States has been able to veto resolutions. Britain has abstained usually on UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire and demanding that international law is adhered to. But unfortunately, that's the design of the UN system. It's still the case that the vast majority of states in the world and the vast majority of people in this country disagreed with Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour Party. We also have to note the now infamous occasion where Keir Starmer was on national radio and was asked the question, and I'm going to quote it because I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting, so I'm going to quote verbatim what he was asked in his answer. Presenter, a siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water, Sir Keir? And Starmer replied, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts.
That's really interesting because we can talk about the Labour Party's movement since then, but it's interesting to think about, even if they've moved in some sort of instances, have they moved on those two core principles of Israel's right to defend itself and Hamas bears responsibility? So let's talk about how they've moved, and let's talk about whether that movement represents anything substantive.
Yeah. So it seems now that Labour's position is to advocate for a ceasefire. And it also seems that, I should also say Keir Starmer later reneged on that particular statement, but it was quite a while afterwards. I think it was a week or 10 days afterwards. He then rode back on the statement, but he basically claimed he had never said what he in fact said.
Yes.
So he didn't apologize. He just misrepresented the initial remarks.
That would have been more plausible if either, like you said, he'd done it a bit quicker, it took him a week or so, or if you hadn't had other Labour politicians basically saying similar things in the interim. So, yeah, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? All politicians lie, but some lies feel just worse than other lies.
And I just want to say also, on the Labour position, there is some level of fudging here.
Right.
Because if you remember, and I don't want to get into the parliamentary technicalities because the audience will fall asleep, but when the Scottish National Party brought an amendment to Parliament calling for an immediate ceasefire and accusing Israel of collective punishment, the mention of collective punishment seemed to be a step too far for the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And they went to great lengths, as we now know, to sabotage the SNP's motion with all kinds of parliamentary tricks and shenanigans. And later, I think it was Harriet Harman who went on a television program and said, well, we didn't like this phrase about collective punishment. And it was reported that Keir Starmer himself didn't like the phrase collective punishment, which suggests that Labour is still unwilling to accept very basic elements of the reality on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting because I also thought there was a little bit with the Labour Party of childishness with that, which was like, we'd like to be the ones who introduce the ceasefire motion because we are the official opposition. And if we allow other people to do it and we just vote, it makes us look weak.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought there was a kind of, in a sense of, I mean, like, it really doesn't matter who introduces this motion. And you've got to be grown up enough to just do that, and they can't. So I think there was that, as well as, like you say, there were certain bits of it that they weren't comfortable acknowledging. I think they do know it. I think there's a lot of things. Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer. He's an expert in international law. Right? All these people have said these things in the past. These are people who know this stuff. And so there's a whole kind of thing about what you know and what you're able to say and acknowledge. I don't think Keir Starmer's forgotten this. I think he does know it's collective punishment.
Yes, I think there's a good chance he knows that. But for reasons of political expediency, one of which is to demonstrate broadly to the ruling class and also to the United States that he's a reliable partner. And it's interesting that one of the arguments that Keir Starmer used when he was asked whether Israel's conduct in Gaza was lawful, he said, well, politicians shouldn't really need to pronounce on all these complex legalistic questions. It takes a long time to settle these things. I was a lawyer, take it from me. Well, he had no trouble doing that when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine.
Yes.
He rendered legal judgment very quickly on that.
But we know Russians, they commit crimes. So, Israel doesn't. Like, this is part of the logic, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's quite clear that this is unprincipled.
Yeah.
But the question is, are we, the people of this country and the Solidarity Movement, going to impose political consequences for that? And I think to some extent, the Labour Party has faced political consequences.
Right.
They have had MPs speak at demonstrations, even though they didn't want that to happen. They have had councillors resign, many councillors resign.
Yeah.
They have had considerable drop in support in the Muslim community in this country, which is electorally not insignificant. So there has been a price to pay for them, which perhaps explains some of the shift.
Right.
There's also been international developments. So we've had the ICJ ruling now.
Right, so that's the International Court of Justice, who heard a case brought by South Africa on accusing Israel of genocide, and that case progressed to the next stage. It hasn't been decided yet, but progressed to the next stage, and there were measures put out saying Israel needs to do this, this, and this.
Yes. It was found that Palestinians have a plausible right to be protected from genocide. And so there's been this, there has been this international, I think, recognition now, broadly, except among some core US allies, that Israel's conduct is unacceptable. But I think, sadly, there's very little chance of either government or opposition policy really changing fundamentally without the US government position changing.
Right. Yes. So the argument that you talk about, the argument Polly Toynbee makes in your chapter, which is that there was no point in Keir Starmer doing anything other than he did. If he had done something other than he did, he would have marked himself out as not a reliable ally of the US, and therefore, in the same way that Jeremy Corbyn had done, rendering himself maybe not completely unelectable, but very hard to elect, because the kind of forces start to crush you at that stage, because you're going against so much that is necessary to keep the world going in the way that it keeps going for the powers that be. What's your response to that argument, that really there was no point in him doing anything, because all that would have happened is either kept the Tories in power or made it more likely the Tories stayed in power?
Well, I think, first of all, the Tories staying in power argument is it's just completely unbelievable. It's a kind of incredible claim now with how the Tories are doing in terms of polling and just in general what we know about the state of the country. I don't think there's any argument to say that Starmer would be more likely to lose the next election, particularly when there's huge public support for a ceasefire.
Right.
and a lot of public sympathy with Palestine. No, I think the argument is, well, we need to be a US ally and we need to show that we're serious about following US leadership. But that's only really something to be uh, concerned about if you want Britain to continue being a kind of servant state of the US.
Yeah.
And clearly, the ruling class in general in this country would like to keep that status quo. But I don't see why, for ordinary people in this country, we should be so similarly invested in that relationship. And, for me, speaking personally, I would like to move toward a world where we don't have dominant superpowers ordering everyone around about what they should do. I think, we have to move to a form of world order where people make decisions democratically and live together in peace.
I'm with you there. It's just very hard making that transition, right? We tried that with Corbyn, and it didn't happen. But anyway, let's talk about whether the question you raised earlier about whether there'll be electoral consequences for Labour, because there is a general election. I do think it's interesting we've got a general election this year. That this issue is that we've got this stark reminder of the gap between the people and the people who rule us at this moment of elections in this country and in the US.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of independents standing.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any chance that Labour will get a bit of a kicking in anywhere for this?
I can't speak to specific constituencies, but I do think there's a good chance that if Labour doesn't necessarily lose a lot of seats, they will be concerned about how close the margins might be.
Okay.
I think that there's already a sign of that with George Galloway's victory in Rochdale. And I think that the Labour Party knows that there might be further consequences of a similar kind. It seems now pretty clear that Jeremy Corbyn is going to stand. In his case, I'm pretty confident saying I think he would win his seat.
I'm going to owe you 20 quid for that if that happens, right?
I think so.
Yeah. We had a bet. If you want to go back and watch one of our earlier videos, we had a bet that I said Jeremy wouldn't stand as an independent, and you said he would.
Mm-hmm.
So 20 quid's not worth as much as it was back then.
Well,
but
I'll take it.
Okay.
I think it's very plausible that there will be a political price.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about where we're at now. And it isn't, even though there's this huge movement, and there is perhaps a political price to be paid by some of our ruling class, it doesn't feel good right at the moment. It feels kind of scary. It feels like forces are kind of crushing us. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been dramatized with the protests in the United States on college campuses.
Yeah.
People are really being cracked down on. But I think in one sense, that's also a measure of the popularity of the cause. Because usually, particularly in liberal democratic states, the governors are content to ignore protest movements when they can ignore them. And repressive measures really only kick in when you have a very powerful popular cause and one that is persistent in opposing government. And I think in this particular case, it's a testament to the power of the movement at this stage and the strength of feeling that these governments feel the need to bring in police. They feel the need to crack down. They feel the need to make examples because this is a genuinely popular cause. It's not some kind of sideshow that you can just ignore as a secondary news item or something like that. This is actually a very serious challenge.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Like I don't know. I guess I'm like everyone. Like every morning, I look at my phone when I wake up, and every morning for 200 plus days now, what we're seeing is people being slaughtered, mass graves, people being starved to death, people being shot at point blank range, horrible videos glorifying this violence, attacks by Israel that go across the region that seem determined to spark a new world war, to draw America into a conflict there. It's a thing to watch. I mean, this is how most people get their news, right? People go on their TikTok, their Insta, their Twitter, whatever it is, and they get that feed. And to see that has a very strong effect. I can see why so many people are moved by this, because that's something you think this shouldn't happen. On a kind of very gut, common sense level, it should be possible for this not to be happening.
Yes, and I think that's a big explanation for why the protests have been so persistent. I mean, we need to be honest that it's incredibly rare for a movement to go with the same level of energy and the same level of turnout 6 months into this devastating assault. And I think that that tenacity is genuinely inspiring and genuinely surprising in some ways. And I think people in this country, as in general with public opinion, have become much more sympathetic to the Palestinian case, especially in recent years and decades. And they know that the government is complicit. They know that the British government sells arms to Israel. They know that the British government suspended funds to the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is the main humanitarian organization in Gaza. They know that the British government, including Lord Cameron, opposed South Africa bringing a case to the International Court. All of that is very clear, and it highlights that the government is complicit in this crime, in this genocide, and we don't want to have our names attached to that sort of crime.
And I think, because the other thing is, you say it's inspiring that people are still coming out, but also what's inspiring is that Palestinians are still resisting. I mean, this is really, I think, when I feel like, I just can't do this anymore, I sort of think, well, I don't really have a right to stop doing it, because people are still resisting decade after decade after decade and finding the strength to do that even now when they're under fire. So I think that, I mean, there was all this stuff, wasn't there, at the beginning of the Russia's attack on Ukraine, of these plucky Ukrainians resisting in the first, and it had been days at that stage. And we're looking at people who've been resisting for decades, and I do think there's a lot of us who find that really inspiring, right? And I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's something about that, seeing that alongside seeing the violence, those two together, which feels very human and very relatable, actually, because a lot of these things work because they demonize people, and clearly Palestinians are demonized, Muslims are demonized, but actually when you see the stories, whether these are fictional stories of films on Netflix, or whether these are stories on social media that people are telling about their own lives, it's totally, I feel like total connection with that. I think people feel a total connection with that.
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, the one thing about the Palestinian cause is it's had an international dimension, I think, for quite a long time. It sort of happened at the same time as the UN system came into being. It sort of had, from the beginning, a kind of internationalist context. And I think that that definitely, the steadfastness of the Palestinian people definitely resonates, not just with other parts of the developing world where you've got people who have suffered under similar colonial systems of oppression, But also increasingly, I think, with people living in the Western countries who realize that this system, this global system, however you want to characterize it, whether you see it as capitalism or the 99% struggling with the 1%, or however you conceptualize it, there's an increasing general consensus that it's not working.
Yeah.
And the way it's not working is being indescribably illustrated in Gaza.
Yeah.
But there are other ways in which people find themselves economically deprived, in which they find themselves disenfranchised from their political systems. And that also has a resonance.
Yeah.
And I think it points to this long-standing principle that we can't separate domestic policy and foreign policy into neat separate boxes. Socialists, at least, have recognized for many, many years that these two things are quite closely connected. There is a set of class interests in Britain which lead to the kinds of inequality and deprivation that we see. But those same class interests favor subordination to the United States and favor the current onslaught against Gaza. And it's a big mistake, and it's sometimes a mistake people make when they criticize the Corbyn movement, when they say, well, why didn't we just have a nice economic agenda and we could have just forgotten about the international stuff, which was too controversial. And I think that's a big mistake, because those two things are inextricably connected. And you can't really effectively tackle one without tackling the other. You're running into the same system of power.
So I think that's very true. And it's a theoretical argument. But I think there's even a very pragmatic argument, which is there aren't. When you have demonstrations for the National Health Service, which everyone loves in this country, you get the left.
Mm-hmm.
You get a few thousand people on the left. I recognise a lot of them, right? When you have demonstrations for Gaza, you get hundreds of thousands of people. It goes way beyond the left. Actually, foreign policy issues, people really deeply care about them. And that's something which I think is really unacknowledged in our society, how much the big demonstrations are about when there are wars going on, when there are people being brutally slaughtered. Because people's basic humanity and connection with people they're told are so different than us is still fundamentally there. It's actually really reassuring, isn't it, about the people of this country that we have rulers that we do not deserve, but we as a people are very united.
Yeah, I think there's a resonance now, especially as many people have pointed out, with the Iraq War demonstrations.
Yeah.
And those are enormous. You have the famous demonstration in London where I think they quoted figures of up to 1 million.
Yeah, I think
people.
It's 1 million, yeah.
And I think now is the first time that we've had demonstrations of similar size.
Yeah.
And it highlights that people do, yes, care about these issues. These aren't just kind of, they're sometimes portrayed, particularly in the liberal press, as a kind of crank obsession of the left, the far left. But no, I mean, clearly there's a much deeper resonance than people want to acknowledge. And so I think that's very hopeful for the future. And I also think that the left, particularly after the Corbyn period, has to be prepared now to rethink and build a new kind of strategy. And I think that this round of mobilizations, because it's been so useful for uncovering the actual nature of the British state and the actual kind of society that we live in, I think that we need to be, for instance, going to war with the Labour Party. And we need to be saying that we can't have someone like Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. We can't accept that because it's way beyond the pale of what the vast majority of people in this country think of as basic good and evil. And I think that, I would like to see much more severe and harsh criticism, particularly from, MPs in parliament and so on, of Keir Starmer's approach. And I think the left in general has to continue to cultivate that independent voice. And I think, we've seen a lot of that with the current crisis, but we could go, much further, I think.
That's a nice note to end on. We could go much further. Let's carry on that conversation at some point about where we go.
Mm-hmm.
That was really, thank you for that. I'm gonna just put this book up again.
But the title is Deluge Gaza and Israel from Crisis to Cataclysm, edited by Jamie Stern Weiner.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie's done a great job with this book, because it's a hard thing to do, to create a book that is going to have staying power through a war that you don't know, and conflict, and a massacre and a genocide that you don't know how it's going to play out. So I would really recommend that people buy this, read it, share it. And thank you, Talal, for helping me get my channel back off the ground.
You're welcome.
And it's been really nice talking to you. And I hope people found this of some use. Please like, share, and add comments. It'd be really good to see what people have to say about this, about the situation, about with anything that we've said that you connected with, or you disagreed with, or you just want to add to. But other than that, goodbye, and hopefully see you soon in another video.